Hey everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to do a deep dive into, well, the mind of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Now, as a philosopher, you've probably run into this idea of pre-established harmony before, but we're going to try to go a little bit beyond that today, really kind of unpack his whole view of the mind. And we're going to use the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide.
That's right. We're going to be talking about some really interesting stuff. We're going to be talking about how Leibniz took on materialism. We'll talk about how he took on dualism. We're going to talk about his very particular way of understanding how the mind and body interact. And we'll even touch on some concepts that feel, I think, surprisingly modern, like apperception and unconscious perceptions.
Okay, wow, that's a lot to cover. But I think maybe a good place to start would be with Leibniz and his attack on materialism. So he uses this really fascinating thought experiment that's called the Mill argument, I believe, to make his point. So imagine you build a machine that is so complex that it can think. I mean, really think, like we do. And then you shrink yourself down, Fantastic Voyage style, and you walk around inside of it.
So what's really interesting about this thought experiment is that even if you could see every single gear turning, every single lever moving, every part interacting perfectly, you still would not be able to find the explanation for experience itself. You would see the mechanics, but you wouldn't see the feeling of thought, the subjective quality of consciousness.
So you're saying, like, even a perfect simulation of thinking wouldn't actually capture what it feels like to think?
Exactly. And, this gets right to the heart of one of Leibniz's main arguments. He says, look, matter is divisible, right? You can break it down into smaller and smaller pieces. But the mind, the I, that's a unity. That's a single indivisible thing. It's not made of parts in the same way matter is.
So he's basically saying that something that's divisible can't create an indivisible experience.
Exactly. And what's fascinating? This argument, which is literally coming from centuries ago, still resonates in modern philosophical arguments against materialism. It really shows you just how deeply Leibniz was wrestling with the nature of consciousness.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how these questions that have been around for so long still feel so relevant to us today. But Leibniz wasn't just critiquing materialism, right? He also had some problems with the other big philosophy of mind from his day, which was dualism, and specifically the way that Descartes explained it.
Right. So Descartes, as you know, he was saying that the mind and the body were two totally different kinds of things, two distinct substances. But Leibniz, he didn't buy that either.
And this is where Leibniz really, I think, flips the script. So for him, everything in the universe is ultimately made of these simple individual units called monads. You can think of them kind of like atoms, but imbued with like kind of primitive awareness.
Yeah. I like to think of it as like the entire universe is woven out of this one type of thread, but those threads are arranged in infinitely complex patterns.
Right. And so some of those threads, some of those monads become minds and others become bodies, but they're all like fundamentally the same stuff at their ore.
Exactly.
But okay, so then that brings up, like a really crucial question. How do these monads, especially minds and bodies, interact? I mean, if they're all ultimately the same kind of thing, how do we explain this connection that we feel between our thoughts and our actions? And this is where I guess we have to bring in the famous pre-established harmony.
Right. That's where the pre-established harmony comes in.
The synchronized clocks analogy.
Yeah.
But I always found that, well, honestly, a little bit tough to wrap my head around.
It is. It's a tricky concept for sure. But one thing that's important to keep in mind, I think, is that Leibniz wasn't saying that our will is like powerless. It's more like, more that our will and our body are just set up from the beginning to be in perfect sync.
Okay, so it's not that my decision to, like, raise my hand actually causes my arm to move. It's more like my mind and body are just kind of pre-programmed so that the thought and the action happen at the same time.
Exactly. And what Leibniz thought was, as the mind is causing things, its perceptions are actually becoming more and more distinct. So, yeah, it's a complex idea, and I think even scholars today are still debating some of the finer points.
Like, why was Leibniz so, like, adamantly against any kind of direct interaction between mind and body? What was he so worried about?
So he really disliked this idea called the influx theory. That was an idea that was trying to explain how something non-physical could influence something physical. And he also had this idea of complete concepts. And what that means is that everything about a substance, including its entire future, is already contained in its concept.
So, like, my monad contains the blueprint for, like, my entire life. including every thought, every action I'm ever going to have.
That's the basic idea. But how that completely rules out any kind of causal interaction is something that, well, scholars are still debating. It really is a mind bender, isn't it? But there's another aspect of Leibniz's thought that's, I think, really interesting, especially for a philosopher, and that's his fascination with language. He called language the best mirror of our thinking.
Oh, wow. So he saw language as more than just like a communication tool. He believed that it could actually reveal something about the structure of our minds. Yeah.
Exactly, yeah. And he even had this dream of creating what he called a universal language. It would be a system where you could break down all concepts into their like simplest parts, and then you would assign symbols to them.
Whoa, that's ambitious. So if we could like create this kind of mental Lego set, we could like in theory make reasoning as precise as like mathematics.
That was the idea. Leibniz believed that with this universal language, you could eliminate ambiguity and you could even solve philosophical problems just through calculation. You could almost say that it's like it anticipates the computational view of mind that's become so influential in modern cognitive science.
Yeah, that's I mean that's pretty mind-blowing. But I guess before we get too carried away with universal languages, maybe we should get back to like the basics of the mind. What did Leibniz actually see as the fundamental building blocks of the mind itself?
Okay, so he actually identified two essential ingredients. Those would be perception and appetition. So basically, in a nutshell, our minds are full of these things called perceptions, which are basically representations of the world around us, and appetitions, which are basically our strivings, our desires, our tendencies to act.
Okay, so perception is how we kind of take in the world, and then appetition is what drives us to like actually do stuff.
Precisely, yeah. But you know how we were talking about monads being simple and indivisible? Well, perception for Leibniz is how a simple monad can represent the complexity of the entire universe. It's like each monad is this tiny little mirror that's reflecting the whole cosmos.
Oh wow, that's a pretty beautiful image. But it also seems a little paradoxical. How can something so simple actually contain so much complexity?
Well, Leibniz described it as the expression of the many in the one. It's a really fascinating idea, and it continues to intrigue philosophers and scientists to this day. And then there's appetition. So appetition for Leibniz isn't just this random urge, it's actually a drive to move from one perception to another, guided by what seems best at the time.
So like it's like a built-in desire to like improve our situation, to kind of like move toward what seems good or beneficial based on how we're perceiving things.
Exactly. And this is where things get, I think, really exciting, especially for a philosopher like yourself, because, Leibniz was actually talking about unconscious perceptions like centuries before Freud and modern
Wait,
psychology.
hold on. Unconscious perceptions. You're saying like that our minds are actually processing information, having experiences that we're not even aware of.
Exactly. So Leibniz proposed these different levels of perception. So some are so faint that they're barely even there. He called these bare perceptions. And then, you have sensate, and then finally you have faults, which are like the most clear and distinct perceptions. But only thoughts, according to Leibniz, have what he called apperception, which is conscious awareness.
So all those like bare perceptions and even some sensations are just happening like under the radar of our conscious mind. That's a pretty radical idea, especially for his time, right?
Oh, yeah, incredibly forward thinking. And, it raises all sorts of fascinating questions. For example, Leibniz wasn't always clear on whether animals have apperception. So do they experience the world consciously the way that we do? Or are they just more like these complex automata, kind of like Descartes thought?
That's a great question. Makes you wonder, like, what are the criteria we should use to determine if something is, actually conscious? But wait, you said Leibniz believed in unconscious perceptions. Did he also think that there were unconscious appetitions?
Yes, he did. He believed that you could have desires and motivations that are operating, beneath the level of your conscious awareness. So not only are we perceiving things without realizing it, but we might also be like driven by desires that we're totally oblivious to.
Man, that's a little unsettling, isn't it? Like, how much control do we actually have if so much is happening like under the surface?
It definitely challenges our assumptions about free will and the nature of the self. It really is a testament to Leibniz's genius that he was, grappling with these questions centuries ago.
It really makes you think, like maybe Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" should be more like something thinks and acts through me, and I'm only vaguely aware of some of it.
Maybe. But before we get too far down that rabbit hole, there's one more fascinating aspect of Leibniz's philosophy of mind that we need to explore, and that is his idea that everything about a substance, its entire past and future, is actually contained within its concept.
Wait, so you're saying, like, my monad, it contains the blueprint for my entire life, every thought, every action I'm ever going to have. That sounds, well, a little deterministic.
It is a very complex idea, and how it relates to free will is, well, it's a question that people are still debating. But Leibniz's argument was that this doesn't mean that, we're just puppets. Our choices are still real, even if even if they're part of this like larger predetermined plan.
Oof, that's a tough one to really wrap your head around. I can see why philosophers are still, still kind of wrestling with these ideas. But maybe before we get too like, lost in the intricacies of Leibniz's metaphysics, we should maybe try to step back and look at the bigger picture here for a second. Like, what are the key takeaways from all this? What makes Leibniz's view of the mind so unique and compelling, especially for a philosopher?
Yeah. I mean, it really has been quite the journey, hasn't it? So let's try to sum it all up. I mean, we've seen how Leibniz really challenged both materialism and dualism, right? And he offered us like this third way to understand the mind-body problem with this, with this really unique concept of monads.
Yeah, and we talked about how his idea of pre-established harmony, how that tries to explain the mind-body relationship, without needing any sort of direct interaction. It's almost like this intricate dance of synchronized monads, each one's kind of playing its part in the in this grand symphony of the universe. And we talked about his ideas about language too, right? How he saw it as almost like a window into how we think, and his really ambitious dream of like creating a universal language that could make reasoning as precise as doing a calculation.
Right. And then there are those incredibly forward-thinking ideas of his about unconscious perceptions and appetition. The whole idea that there's so much of our mental life that's actually going on kind of beneath the surface without us even being aware of it. I mean, that idea is still, it's still making waves in modern psychology and philosophy today.
I mean, it really is remarkable, to think that Leibniz was already wrestling with these kinds of complex and profound questions, like centuries ago. But I guess for a philosopher like yourself, what are the real lasting implications of all of this? What can we take away from this deep dive into, into the world of Leibniz?
Well, I think that Leibniz really offers us this really powerful reminder that the big questions, the ones about consciousness, the self, the relationship between the mind and the body. I mean, these are really enduring questions. People have been thinking about these things for centuries, and they continue to challenge us today. And I think Leibniz's insights, even the ones that might seem strange or maybe even a little counterintuitive at first, they really force us to think more deeply. To question our assumptions and to really consider different points of view.
He definitely didn't make it easy for us to just accept like simple answers, but maybe that's like the whole point of philosophy, to keep us questioning, to keep us exploring.
Exactly. And here's one final thought-provoking point for you to think about. Leibniz, with all of his emphasis on internal harmony and the self-contained nature of monads, it's possible that he underestimated the power of embodiment. What if the very structure of our bodies, the way we physically interact with the world, what if that shapes our minds in ways that he didn't totally account for?
So you're saying like even if there's no direct causal interaction going on between the mind and body, the physical world might still be providing like a kind of scaffolding for our mental experience.
Exactly. Think about how our senses shape how we perceive the world, how our emotions are tied to our physical states, how even how our language is grounded in our bodily experiences. Maybe there's a deeper connection between the mind and body than Leibniz imagined. It's definitely something to ponder as you continue your own philosophical explorations.
Well, there you have it, everyone. A deep dive into the fascinating and often very encouraging world of Leibniz's philosophy of mind. We hope you enjoy the journey, and maybe you've come away with a new appreciation for this brilliant and a very enigmatic thinker.
Until next time, keep those philosophical gears turning.